On December 12th, 2025, President Donald Trump is facing a problem he can't solve with rhetoric because this week, U.S. authorities seized an oil tanker in the Caribbean linked to Venezuela crude shipments, and Reuters reported it like it won't be the last. Now, the moment a great power begins physically taking energy cargo at sea, the story is no longer about sanctions, paperwork, or diplomatic language. It becomes about enforcement. It becomes about credibility. And it becomes about how far the world will tolerate power being exercised before it begins to actually push back. Because this escalation did not happen because of an abstract system drifting out of control. It happened because specific people in Washington chose to enforce pressure this way through sanctions, through maritime seizures, through actions that signal the United States can reach into global shipping lanes and disrupt energy flows at will. So the deeper question becomes this. The deeper question is not whether this is about Venezuela alone. The real question is, what happens to the global order when seizures, sanctions, and coercive enforcement become routine tools? And when other states conclude that survival requires building parallel systems outside of Western control. That is where this story actually lives. Now, Venezuela's government has already described the tank seizure as an act of international piracy, insisting the country will not become an oil colony. And that language, it really matters. It is not rhetorical excess. It is the language of a sovereignty under pressure. And in a multipolar world, sovereignty is not symbolic, it's leverage. Now, states that can defend it gain agency. States that cannot become warnings. And what makes this episode more consequential is that the enforcement itself is not entirely new. Some of the legal targeting behind these seizures traces back to early sanction designations, meaning the tools were already in place. So what's changed is the willingness to use them more openly and more aggressively. That produces a second order effect that many in Washington completely underestimate. Now, when sanctions and seizures become bipartisan, durable policy rather than temporary measures, targeted countries stop interpreting them as responses to specific behavior. They interpret them as permanent features of Western power. And permanent features demand permanent workarounds. And this is a lesson being absorbed across the global South. This escalation also exposes a strategic bind. Because when pressure campaigns fail to deliver outcomes in larger theaters, most notably Ukraine, the temptation grows to demonstrate power elsewhere. Now, smaller targets begin to look like proof of control projects, not because they matter more, but because they appear easier to manage, closer to home, and historically conditioned to pressure. But treating Venezuela as low-hanging fruit is a gamble rooted in an outdated model of leverage. That model assumes sanctions isolate, pressure fractures elites, and economic pain eventually produces political compliance. The record in Venezuela challenges that assumption. Despite years of sanctions, economic collapse, and isolation attempts, the state did not fall. Instead, it adapted. And part of that endurance came from internal cohesion. Part came from policy shifts that redirected resources towards domestic stabilization. But a critical component came from external relationships, especially with China and Russia, and increasingly with Iran. And that prevented total isolation. So this is the structural shift Washington struggles to fully confront. Sanctions are designed to isolate countries, but isolation fails when targeted states have partners who see strategic value in keeping them alive. And when those partners provide financing, infrastructure support, energy cooperation, and military assistance, sanctions become blunt instruments rather than decisive ones. That is why calls of solidarity from Moscow matter. When Vladimir Putin reaffirms support for Venezuela's sovereignty, it is not simply ideological alignment. It is a signal to other non-aligned states. If pressure comes for you, alignment creates options. Now, you may not be rescued, but you won't be alone. And that is important. And that signals incentives, or it incentivizes hedging. And hedging, when it spreads, weakens Western leverage. So this does not mean Venezuela will be defended militarily by external powers in the event of escalation. History actually suggests otherwise. But external allies rarely send troops unless direct interests demand it. Now, the burden of resistance would fall primarily on Venezuelans themselves. Multipolarity does not mean intervention guarantees. It means economic lifelines, diplomatic cover, and support systems that raise the cost of coercion. And that distinction matters because it leads to the most dangerous fork in this road. When financial pressure fails to break a target, escalation tends to shift towards uglier tools. Covert operations, sabotage, or limited strikes designed to shock rather than conquer. But limited bombing campaigns carry their own risks. They often consolidate domestic support for a targeted government, intensify national resistance, and produce regional instability rather than actual compliance. And instability does not stay contained. It spills into migration flows, energy markets, insurance pricing, and shipping routes. It teaches other states that dependence is dangerous, and it accelerates the construction of alternative financial systems, trade corridors, and security partnerships. That is how enforcement decays. Now, zooming out, this is the same dynamic visible in Ukraine right now. The United States continues to search for a way to freeze the conflict without conceding defeat, while Russia, believing it holds battlefield momentum, has little incentive to accept a pause that simply allows rearmament. So talks repeat, optics shift, but outcomes, they just don't. And in a world where adversaries can absorb pressure, time itself becomes leverage. The side that can endure political cycles, sanction regimes, and narrative swings gains strategic advantage without needing dramatic escalation. And this is the quiet lesson unfolding across multiple theaters all at once. All right, guys, do you think I have this all right? Do I have it all wrong? Put it in the comment section below. I look forward to reading and replying to all your guys' comments. And thank you again so much for watching me here on The Baseline. All right, cheers, everybody.